everyone, and welcome back to Quantum Talk. We are very excited to do episode 2 today, and today we are going to talk about what is trauma. So I think something that's very important is in our previous episode, we spoke about trapped trauma frequencies in the body. And so we're going to touch on today, what is it? How does it work? How does it become trapped? What does it mean if you have trapped trauma in your body? Okay. So just very important to note that we are certified quantum consultants. We cannot diagnose any illness, disease, or any ailment. None of the therapy or advice that we give in this podcast or any of our other podcasts is to be construed as medical advice or any form of prescription. If you are ill or you have any worrying symptoms, please contact a healthcare professional immediately.
Yes, so it's important to know that this podcast is only for informative purposes. But without further ado, let's start. And today we're just going to look at what is trauma and how we respond to trauma. So, Natanya, the definition of trauma, according to the American Psychological Association, is an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, a rape, or a natural disaster. Yes, that is trauma, but I don't agree with that as the whole definition of trauma, because we know that a person may experience trauma as a response to any event that they find physically, emotionally, or spiritually threatening or harmful. So this is a very restricted definition that we find the APA gives. Trauma is unique to the person. What is trauma to one person may not be trauma to another. And I've seen this so many times in sessions as well. You know, you can have one client that sits there crying, it's terrible, this and this happened. And, you know, then I think to myself, okay, yes, that's bad, but it's not that bad. And then you have another client. I deal with a lot of sexual abuse clients. And if you hear these stories, it kind of makes everyone else's trauma look not that bad. And what I learned from the very beginning was not to think that way, because trauma is trauma. Whatever you experience as trauma is valid. It needs to be validated and respected because it is your trauma and it's your story. So I don't know, would you like to comment on this?
I also think obviously, like, the more stress you have in your life, the easier it is for you to experience trauma. So the event itself might not be the most traumatic thing that you've ever experienced or that has ever happened to you. But if you have external stress at work or at home, something small can become very traumatic if you are already strained as a person. And I also think accumulated small experiences of small traumas, you know, can build up and become one big issue. Whereas if you look, for example, with people that go through big accidents or sexual assault or natural disasters, it's big events, it's life-changing, you know. And so it's easy to understand that that person is going through trauma, but sometimes I think we forget about the extreme trauma that can build up if it's not dealt with over time.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so how would you know if you've experienced trauma? So if you're watching us right now and you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, am I one of those people that have experienced trauma? Am I even aware if I've experienced trauma? How would you know? Well, a traumatized person can experience a range of emotions. And what's important is, and I always explain this to clients as well, is some of it is during the traumatic event. So let's say it's a car accident. So while you're in the event, you may experience shock or horror, but some of the trauma you experience can be immediately after. So now the event's over and you're talking to the police or you're talking to your husband, and there's other emotions that come after the event, but it's still linked to that same traumatic event. And then sometimes even long after the event. So now you're driving in the car 3 years later, someone skips a traffic light and you're nearly in an accident again, and you kind of react out of that old wound. So because of the old trauma, there's new trauma that you're experiencing right now. So when you're asking yourself, have I experienced trauma? Don't just think of the event itself. Ask yourself, how did how did this affect me immediately after the event, and how is it still affecting me now? So
And
trauma
I
can,
think I think a good gauge for that is also if you years after still talking about the event and crying, that's a sure tell. Or if you still are triggered by
yes,
certain things, that means that even though you might have gone for counseling or for help or seen someone, it means that the physical emotions or the memory of the trauma might still be stuck in your body.
yes.
So even the people who have tried to deal with it, but still react toward it, is still experiencing the trauma today.
That's a very valid point that I saw that in my own life. There's certain things that happened in my life where I thought, oh, I've dealt with this, I'm fine. And then something happens that triggers a memory, and I react in such an emotional way that I realize, no, you're not okay. So that's a very good gauge to check, even if it's years after something's happened. If you're still reacting in a very intense emotional way, chances are very good that you haven't processed that trauma correctly. So trauma can make a person feel overwhelmed, helpless, or shocked. I know of some people that when they go through a trauma, they become so overwhelmed that they shut down. They stop feeling, yes, they stop feeling anything. So they'll say to me, you know what, I know I should be upset, I know I should be crying, but I just can't. I don't feel anything. And it's a kind of survival mechanism in that moment that they go into. And I think it's okay, but it's not okay when that is still going on 6 months down the line or a year afterwards. There's certain phases of grief that we need to work through if we've gone through a traumatic event, and somewhere you need to face the emotions and deal with it. So some people
suppressing it will not heal it.
No.
It will only prolong
the
suffering.
So what happens if you get stuck in that overwhelmed feeling of being shut down? That's where we find a lot of people that are just emotionally shut down from the world. Like they can't connect to their wife, to their children, to people, and that's often due to a traumatic event as well. Another thing is helpless. Helpless, the definition is basically feeling like a victim. You feel like a victim of circumstances, or you feel like a victim of abuse. You feel like you're powerless. So when you get someone that often has this victim mentality or often feels like the victim, it's also a sign that there's trauma that you haven't dealt with. And then obviously shock, that goes more to the PTSD side of not processing trauma. So all these emotions that are not processed correctly could lead to physical or emotional symptoms. And that's important, because if you're sitting here trying to assess yourself and trying to figure out, have I got trauma that I haven't dealt with? Some people will manifest it in a physical symptom, and we're going to look at that now. And some people will manifest it in an emotional symptom. So there isn't one rule that says, this is what it looks like when you've got trauma that you haven't processed correctly. It's going to be different for every one of us. So let's look at unprocessed trauma, and that can basically lead to long-term effects in a person's emotional and physical health. And when these symptoms persist, it actually becomes a form of PTSD. So PTSD basically is that the severity of the symptoms of the trauma that you experienced, the fear, the anxiety, the shock, that doesn't change. It doesn't go away. It's like it's happening right now and you're still reacting out of that. So that's when someone really got stuck in a very traumatic event. So let's look at some of the emotional symptoms of trauma. Anxiety. And you know what, I don't know about you, but that's something that a lot of my clients struggle with. I've got a lot of clients that will have anxiety, and everyone displays it in a different way as well. So some people are very high functioning anxious people. So you won't say, oh, that person struggles with anxiety. And it's usually the people that are very driven, goal orientated, very perfectionistic. And then you get people that are just so they can't do anything. Their anxiety is so bad. It's like they get paralyzed.
Immobilized,
yes. So anxiety is a big, big red flag.
I think something that not a lot of people know, but you feel anxiety as butterflies in your stomach, for example. And anxiety has a huge effect on your digestive system.
Mm.
And a physical example of that is everyone knows that stomach ulcers, for example, are can be stress-related symptoms. And so in that specific sense, we even see in the medical world, they'll know, like, if you have a stomach ulcer, the first question they'll ask you is, are you stressed?
Mm.
Because they know that the emotion of stress will have that effect on your body.
Mm.
And so that's a nice example of how an emotion, if it's not dealt with over time, will roll over into a symptom physically.
Yes. And what's interesting as well, now that you mentioned the gut, is there's a part in Quantum Soul where we teach the parents how to help their children to process their emotions correctly, because children really struggle, especially when they're younger, to articulate how they're feeling. They tend to try and communicate their emotions with physical symptoms. So they'll say, my stomach is sore, or I've got a headache, or I feel nauseous. But it's not actually a physical symptom. What they're experiencing often is anxiety. So what we do in Quantum Soul as well is we've done a little chart that the parent can print out that's got pictures on. And we encourage them to laminate it and put it on the fridge. So if your child comes and they say they look a bit down or they've got a stomach ache, you can ask them, point to mommy, what picture are you feeling at this moment? And that helps children to also learn that they need to communicate their emotions and they need to process it correctly. So anxiety is something that children often feel, especially when they start a new year at school or new school, they move to a new town and they don't know how to communicate that they'll say, I've got a stomach ache or I'm nauseous. Okay, depression is another emotional symptom. And yes, you do get an imbalance in a person's hormones that can lead to depression. But sometimes that imbalance is actually caused by a trauma that gets stuck in the body that causes the adrenals or not the adrenals, the endocrine system to get imbalanced. And that can lead to depression. Denial. Anger outbursts and irritability. I think we all know someone in our lives that have a bit of anger issues or that are very irritable. That's usually a sure sign of trauma that hasn't been dealt with. Self-harm.
Especially, I want to say, if you have grown up with anger outbursts and irritability, you can trace the trauma back to their childhood. Think about children throwing tantrums, right? Why do they throw a tantrum? They throw it because their brains are not developed enough to process what is happening to them. And it builds up and it comes out in anger and irritability. And if that then becomes either a pattern in the body that's there for a long period of time, or the trauma is undealt with from the childhood and it then bursts out. And a lot of, anger outbursts and irritability from childhood, and you carry that through to your adult life, it doesn't necessarily say that you are a narcissist, but you'll have a lot of narcissistic traits that you can identify with that. And it is all born out of trauma. And if you can just deal with the trauma, then you can make this person's life a little bit better.
Definitely. Another thing with anger outbursts is that it's often linked to a feeling of being helpless. So as a child, they felt helpless and powerless, and now they're acting out. So that makes sense. Self-harm, and self-harm is anything you do that's abusive towards yourself, even unhealthy eating habits, not looking after your body in a healthy and godly way, all kinds of, then you get like the severe stuff where people will cut themselves or try to commit suicide and all of those things. But any form, even overworking and not having boundaries, all of that is a form of
over-gymming.
Yes, overtraining.
Over-gymming. And a lot of people, something that I see nowadays a lot, especially with the younger clients, I see a lot of teenagers, is there's this sense of, I deserve to be punished, or I must punish myself. And they go on these binges of not eating or not eating enough. And that's seen to the body as self-harm. And also the conversations that you have with yourself in your head can also be harmful to yourself. If you call yourself names, or you put yourself down, or you are your own worst critic, you are self-harming.
Yes.
Whether the scars are on your arm or not.
Exactly. Yes, because your body, soul, and spirit. If you're hurting your body, or whether you're hurting your soul, or whether you're hurting your spirit, it's still a form of self-harm. Okay. Shame and guilt, that's a big one. And that's often also found with victims that have been sexually abused. There's a lot of shame and guilt that comes with that. Shutting down emotionally. So we discussed that earlier, the numbness, not connecting emotionally, feeling hopeless, difficulty concentrating. And I think that's a big one, especially for children, but adults as well. Have you seen how difficult it is for some adults to sit and just sit through a conversation or sit and focus on something, and they're grabbing their phones or checking this and doing that and getting up? So that's also a sign of trauma that hasn't been dealt with. And then obviously addictions. So those are all, and they're not all the symptoms, but they're all examples of some of the emotional
Most common.
Yes, that could indicate that there's trauma that's not been dealt with. Now let's look at some of the physical symptoms, because we also have a lot of people that come and see us that say, you know, I've got this problem and I can't get any healing. I've tried everything and the symptom won't go away. So autoimmune disease, that's a big one. And you know, autoimmune disease, the root of that is self-rejection. And self-rejection often comes from rejection experienced in the womb or in your childhood, and you start internalizing that rejection and you start rejecting yourself. And then your body starts acting out physically that self-rejection. And that's where a lot of autoimmune disease comes from. And did you know?
Oh, sorry, you can go.
Did you know that even allergies is a form of autoimmune disease? So you don't have to sit here and think, oh, well, I don't have lupus, or I don't have alopecia, or I don't have this or that. It's even allergies is a autoimmune disease. Arthritis is a form of autoimmune disease. So that's a biggie. Sorry.
I think something that's interesting is that autoimmune disease often is traced back to the thymus gland. Now, the thymus sits on top of the heart. Now, we know, being trained in this, that your heart is the only organ that experiences all of your emotions. And because it's experiencing all of that emotions, and the thymus is sitting on top of the heart, if your heart is broken time after time after time, and you're rejected time after time after time, you start thinking, there must be something wrong with me, that all of these things happen to me, or that this or this or this happens. And so you see an emotional detachment of the heart sort of taking place, and that affects the thymus, and you see it then later on acting out as autoimmune disease.
Yeah. It's actually amazing how our bodies are created. And you know what's interesting is, especially with stuff like autoimmune disease, they're one of those things where the doctors will tell you it's incurable. There's nothing we can do for you. We can manage the symptom. And don't get me wrong, there is a place for medicine. There is a place for doctors, definitely, and we honor them and we bless them. But often when they say this is incurable, it's because they don't understand what the root is. They only get taught in medical school to deal with the symptom. They don't get taught to look for the root. And that's really what we want to do with quantum counseling, is we don't want to suppress the symptom and manage your symptom for the rest of your life. We want to try and get to the root and trust the Lord that as there's healing that takes place in that emotional wound, that the body will start to fall in line and that there'll be healing in the body. So another physical symptom is headaches, digestive issues, and that's a big one that people struggle with as well. Chronic fatigue, memory loss, and memory loss is a big symptom of trauma, especially when you're in trauma. I remember when I went through one of my traumas in my 20s, you know, I was like 27. I mean, what person that's 27 forgets the person that they just spoke to yesterday? But I went through such a difficult time that I really struggled with my memory. And even now, when I think back, sometimes people will say, do you remember we did this or that? And then I'm like, no, it's like my mind just wiped it. And how I explain it to people that are in trauma is that it's like your computer. You know, when you open a lot of programs on your computer and your computer gets stuck, that's what happens when you're in trauma. And the first thing that gets stuck is your short-term memory, because there's too many things that's open and your brain's struggling to process everything. And then it kind of gets stuck and your short-term memory gets affected. But we also,
and that's also, sorry.
No, it's okay. We also
It's also
find,
a survival mechanism.
yes, I wanted to say that now that when
Mm.
there's especially trauma as a child, and there's a form of dissociation that takes place. It's like you said, it's because their brains can't process it at that stage. But you know what? That's what's so amazing about quantum counseling is that I had a client once. She really had a very traumatic childhood and she had no memory. Up until the age of 24, she couldn't remember anything that happened in her life. So she used to book sessions, and then her mom did a timeline for her and would say to her, okay, when you were this old, this happened. When you were this old, we moved here. When you were this old, this happened. So that in the sessions, if we test and we find an emotional trauma or a physical trauma, and we could tell her, I could tell her, okay, this was about this age, she could look on the timeline and say to me, yes, that makes sense because my mom says at this time, this is what happened. But she had no conscious memory of that. That's how traumatic her life was for her. High blood pressure, that's also a big one. Cancer, ailments with no cure. So those are, like I said again, with the emotional symptoms as well. It's not all of the symptoms, but it's the most common ones that I think a lot of people may identify with. So if you're sitting with one of these things, chances are very good that there's some kind of trauma or an accumulation of trauma that's leading to the symptom. Did you want to comment
Or
on it?
inherited trauma.
Yes. Yeah, that's
you know,
a big one.
lot of yes, a lot of us don't realize. So, for example, in my case, like I sat with all of these emotions, and looking back on my life, trying to find the trauma, and it wasn't necessarily the experiences didn't warrant the reaction, but a lot of it was prenatal, and a lot of it was just inherited stuff from the bloodline.
Yes.
And so so people just also sometimes look at you and think you're overreacting, or you're just playing the victim or whatever. But and I think it's very important for people who does choose to become quantum counselors, like we said earlier, to validate each person's feelings, because what they're feeling is real to them.
Yes.
And you don't know where that feeling is coming from. It might be an accumulated trauma from 12 generations that's built up to this person, and it's quite interesting always to find the root, to see where it comes from. And it's also like a puzzle. It's never just your own experiences, it's sometimes it's also just there's that saying, hurt people, that if you are hurting, you will probably hurt someone else. And and I think that's also a way of tracing back. Your family life might have been great, but no one escapes trauma in their life, whether it's big or small.
No, I actually think we should do a whole episode just on generational trauma. I'd love to do that. I'd like to tell you one story just to kind of whet your appetite, and then we hope to see you when we do that podcast. But I had a client who struggled with her weight, and she told me that there's something wrong with her. Like if there's food, she feels like she needs to eat everything. It's like a little voice in her head is telling her, you need to eat all the food while there's food. And she says to me, Alzana, I know that's stupid because I can just get in my car and drive around the corner and buy food. And, so food has never been an issue in her life. So we started testing, and it was actually, I think it was 3 or 4 generations back. And when we did the calculation, we realized that whoever that forefather was in a concentration camp when it was the Boer War. In South Africa, there was a concentration camp, and the people didn't have enough food. And so there was that thing that was recorded on her DNA, that survival mechanism that kicked in for that person that experienced the hunger, to make sure that everyone after them wouldn't go hungry. So we need to put on that epigenetic marker that tells you eat while there's food, and that was an interesting session to do. So that's a great example of generational trauma, and knowing that the way you're reacting is not normal, but you can't help it because that's how you feel. Okay, so let's move on. How does trauma lead to symptoms? Because now we've talked a little bit about trauma, gets stuck in the body, but how does it lead to symptoms? So trauma gets stuck in the body as a physical frequency. And if you've got more questions about this, I really encourage you to go to the website and buy Quantum Physics and Counseling, because we go into a lot of detail about frequency and trauma and the communication systems in the body, and how the trauma kind of blocks up the communication systems in the body and causes symptoms. So part of releasing the trauma frequency is by processing, because if we process it correctly, it doesn't get stuck. It's because we don't process it, because we suppress it or we ignore it, that it becomes stuck in the body. So let's look at some practical ways of processing. The first is talking. That's actually one of the valid ways of releasing it. So going for therapy, counseling, inner healing, that releases a lot of the trauma that's stuck in the body. Writing is also a great way to process. Some people struggle to talk to people. It's easier for them to take a journal and just jot down. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a great writer. Just write down how you feel, because that helps people to acknowledge their emotions and work through it.
I just want to interject here, sorry, with the writing. A lot of times with the writing, something that really helps. I had a client the other day, and we are working through some of her trauma. And we was talking about it, and I said to him, you need to forgive these people. You need to let go of this. And she said, how am I to forgive someone if they haven't apologized? So I said, you write them a letter, and after you've done your letter, you see it as done with. You know, so writing, I know one of my close friends in varsity, her mother died, and she never got to say goodbye. She didn't make it to the hospital in time. And I know that our mom said to her, why don't you write your mom a letter to say goodbye? You know, so even if it is for, writing can be used for the situations where you were never given the opportunity to say what you needed to say and to get it off of your chest.
Yes, I've also said that to clients before, and that's very helpful to write it, even if that person's not there anymore. It helps you to get closure. So another one is prayer, and then obviously quantum therapy. And that's what we've been talking about. So you can try any one of these. What I find very helpful with the quantum therapy is that the talking and the writing kind of deals with your soul, the prayer deals with your spirit, but the quantum therapy deals with your body. And I really feel like you need to take that holistic approach when there's been a trauma. You need to deal with it in the spirit, in your soul, and in the body. And there's really, at this stage, nothing I know of that's a better way to deal with trauma in the body than the quantum therapy. Okay, so last year, I want to just explain to people, I love this picture, the straw that broke the camel's back. So a trauma in the body can be there for years before a symptom appears. And many people experience their trauma in childhood that leads to symptoms later in their lives. So what I've found is that sometimes I'll get a client that books a session with me, and they'll say to me, oh, I just got cholesterol and high blood pressure out of nowhere. I've always been healthy. The doctor doesn't understand why. It doesn't make sense. I don't know where this is coming from. And then, you know, they often want to attribute it to, well, I've gone through a stressful few months. And yes, it could be, but our bodies are really resilient. Most often, our bodies is like this camel. It can take on a load and take on more and take on more and take on more. And it's what you talked about earlier, that it's often accumulated trauma. So it's not just one thing that caused the symptom. It's often lots of traumas that you've just started that got stuck in the body. And then eventually that last little thing, that's the thing that just where your body says, that's it. I can't anymore. I can't deal with this anymore. So we kind of, what I tell clients sometimes is that we reverse engineering your emotional trauma. So we're starting with the symptom, and we're asking the body, what is the puzzle pieces that we need to get to that's making up this picture that forms this symptom? And sometimes it doesn't always work in chronological order, but the body prioritizes what it's ready to deal with. Okay. So there is hope. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh my goodness, so what now? There is hope. Trauma in the body can be identified and released. We can identify trauma that took place as far back as conception. And I think we should do a podcast about that as well.
Yes.
Conception and prenatal trauma, because that's like a whole new avenue, and it's really interesting, and we'll take some good examples from our own clients. But we can even go back to conception and find trauma there through quantum. And you don't need to have a conscious memory. So some people will tell me, but I don't remember what happened. And that's okay, because we're dealing with your body. And we talk about that in quantum physics and counseling as well, where your body is one big computer, that your subconscious mind is like a hard drive, and it just saves everything. So we deal with subconscious memory and body memory. We don't deal necessarily with conscious memory. So it's okay if you don't remember.
And something else that's amazing is, especially the men, they don't like talking about their traumas. And
Yes.
so another thing is, you don't have to talk for us to deal with these things. You
Yes.
don't have to relive your deepest, darkest secrets in order for us to help you.
Yes.
And that's something that one of my friends told a friend about quantum counseling, and she booked a session. And the first thing she asked me was, will I have to talk about my trauma? And I said, absolutely not. I will not. You don't have to divulge anything. Actually, the less I know, the better. Because then you know that what I'm getting is what your body is telling me, and not what you've told me that I'm now trying to prove or whatever.
Yes.
And so those sessions are actually my favorite, when I know nothing. And, you start testing, and you can see on the people's faces. I remember we just got to something so simple, a simple emotion. And I explained to her what this emotion does in the body. And she just started tearing up.
Oh,
and I immediately knew this took her back to a trauma that I will never push her to talk about. But I mean, and I could see that there's gratitude in not having to talk about it. Because, some people, like, you do get two different types of people. You do get people that are talkers, and they want to talk through their trauma. It helps them, it heals them. But introverts mostly, they don't want to talk about it. They want to get better, but they don't want to talk about it. And this is such an amazing tool for me, is that if you want to talk about it, great, let's talk. If you don't, great, let's just release the emotions, and you'll get better anyway.
Yes.
And that's what's amazing for me, is whatever the client is comfortable with, whether it is talking or not talking, you'll be helped equally.
Yes. Yes. And even children, I find it very helpful with children, because their bodies do the talking, and animals. I think we should also do a podcast on animals.
One about oh goodness, that took my breath away.
Okay.
Such a shock. Yes, we'll definitely do one about animals. I have this one client that always sends me pictures and videos of the dog, because I did sessions for the dog, and it was absolutely amazing. So yeah, we'll do a few episodes on that as well.
Yes. Yes.
So
So
the bloodline, the dogs.
yes, we're going to do quite a few. So stay tuned, and we hope to see you in our next podcast. Be blessed.
Thank you very much. See you next time.